Well, I had a really interesting idea. I wanted to take this macro timeline that I did on a micro notebook and I wanted to expand it and really explain the Genesis detailed timeline. So that's what we're going to do today in this video. We're going to go through all the key moments of Genesis in the timeline. And I'm also going to go through the covenantal thread through Genesis. And in case we haven't met, I'm Alexis Wade, and I'm a theologian and a minister for over 20 years, and I teach the Bible visually. That's what I do, so if you're a visual learner, welcome. All right, let's get started. The first thing you need to know is Genesis is 50 chapters, and it's divided from chapters 1 to 11 and chapters 12 to 50. 1 through 11 is called the Primeval history, and 12 through 50 is the Patriarchal history. But before we get to that breakdown, I wanted to go over the overarching covenantal thread through Genesis, because Genesis sets the stage for the entire Bible. If you don't understand Genesis, you're likely not going to understand any of it. So the covenantal thread is very, very prominent in Genesis. And of course, we have to start off with chapters 1 through 2, where creation happens through God, and there's a mandate, which is just what God expects the created humans to do. So the first place in the covenantal thread is in Genesis 3:15. It is called proto-evangelium, which is the first good news. And the first good news is that evil will eventually be crushed. It's natural to read Genesis 3 and think, it's all about consequence and punishment, but there's hope. It's the beginning of the covenant happens there. The restoration, the plan of redemption happens right at the fall. God begins rectifying what the humans have messed up. So continuing with our covenantal thread, we're going to move on to Genesis 9:8 through 17, which is the Noahic covenant. And the symbol of the covenant is a rainbow. And what this symbolizes is God says he will never again destroy the earth with a flood. And then we move to the next major covenant, the formation of God's people through Abraham. So this is 15:1 through 21. And Abraham is promised that he will be the father of many nations. And not only is there stars to symbolize this, there's the act of circumcision to be part of this family in Genesis 17. Then we move on to a covenantal renewal through Isaac in chapter 26. God reaffirms the Abrahamic promise through Isaac. Then we move to chapter 35, which the covenant is reaffirmed again. God is saying this is happening, and this happens at Bethel. And we end on the big covenantal thread with Joseph, how God uses him to preserve his people's lineage. So that's the overarching covenantal thread that you should understand Genesis through. Now let's go to the main points of Genesis, the storyline thread that you're probably more familiar with. Of course, the Bible, Genesis opens with that God created the heavens and the earth. And so we walk through that in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and then in 3, humanity messes up, and it's called the fall. There's a rupture. They're removed from Eden. There's consequences to their actions. The rest of the Bible is all about those consequences to eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the restoration from that fissure. The humans are out of the garden, and immediately we see in chapter 4 the first murder. Cain kills Abel. Immediately, when humans are away from God's presence, we see the gravity of sin and brokenness. Chapter 5 moves on to the genealogy. And then we come into a section which from 6 to 8, which is the flood and the Noahic covenant. Now, the flood happens because the world is so wicked and evil, and God just says he's going to wipe it out and save only the people that will listen, which happens to be Noah and his people, on an ark. And then makes that promise, like I said earlier, that he'll never again destroy the earth with a flood. So sometime later, the earth is populated again, nations spread, and that's in chapter 10. And in chapter 11, we see the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel is humanity doing what humanity does, and they coalesce and come together and say, hey, we can be as good as God. It's a form of self-exaltation, and it's a echo of what happened in the garden when the first humans evaluated the fruit and decided, apart from God, that it was good to eat. So this is a mirror of that, and it will just mirror throughout all of the stories in Scripture of how humanity constantly wants to be like God instead of being governed by God. So 11, even though God dispersed the tower and broke up the nations and spread people throughout the whole earth, he decided to create a line to Abram. And this is really important. This is our pivotal move from primeval history. Remember, Genesis 1 through 11 is primeval history. And then the back half of Genesis 12 to 50 is the patriarchal history. And this Tower of Babel and the line to Abram in chapter 11 is right before we make that switch. And at chapter 12, Abram is called by God. Abraham, the whole covenantal line is beginning, that God is going to form his own people. We see that after he's called, there is the sign of the covenant that I went over in the covenantal thread portion at the bottom half of this page. The Abraham storyline falls between chapters 12 to 25. It's a big portion of Genesis, and there's a reason, because Abraham's the father of the nation. And so there's a lot in here. There's Isaac's birth in chapter 21. Then the sacrifice of Isaac in 22, which is its own rich theological story. Then there is the death of Sarah and Abraham in chapter 23 and 25. Now we move into the Isaac storyline, which is quite short because Isaac overlaps Abraham, and really the adult piece of Isaac is 25 to 27, starting with his marriage to Rebekah and the births of Jacob and Esau in 25. And then his other big story is chapter 27, when the blessing is passed to Jacob through deception, which moves us into Jacob's storyline, which is a little bigger, not as big as Abraham. And so we begin at 27, again, with the blessing passed to Jacob through deception, bypassing Esau, and also how Jacob flees to Haran, dreams of a ladder, and the covenantal confirmation. Then he has marriage to Leah and Rachel, and birth of 12 sons, 29 to 30. Jacob also wrestles with God and he's renamed Israel in 32. And then in chapter 35, Jacob has reconciliation with Esau, his brother, and the covenant is reaffirmed at Bethel. Now we move on to Joseph's storyline, which is the second biggest behind Abraham. And Joseph, poor Joseph, was sold by his brothers into slavery in chapter 37. Chapters 39 to 41, we see Joseph's rise in Egypt. And 42 through 47, we see that Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams and that the famine leads Joseph's family to come to Egypt and be preserved through Joseph's status. And at the end, we see Jacob in chapter 48 through 49 blesses his sons and predicts the tribe's futures, which is really important for the Pentateuch, is the end of the whole Old Testament. But the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, or you may know them as the Torah. So the tribes are super important. And then we finish again, if we remember back to the covenantal thread with 50, with the preservation of God using Joseph to save his people. Now, there's one final thing that I want to speak to before we conclude this visual Bible study, detailed timeline dive, if you will, is the primeval history versus the patriarchal history. And I coined that the Genesis divide. I don't know if anybody else has called that, but it just kind of came out in my notes. And so 1 through 11 is the story of all humanity, okay? We don't have tribes. We don't have the father figure of Abraham yet. We don't have anything. And we also don't even have datings, okay? 12 to 50 is the covenantal focus. That one chosen family of God will be the one to redeem, that God will work through to redeem the world. And this happens at the break from 11 to 12. Remember the line to Abram, that Shem's line shows God's covenantal purposes are carried through history despite sin. So, as a theologian, as a biblical scholar, I often, think of, people's counters to Genesis particularly, and how mean God is. And all I see is God extending grace despite humans' rebellious nature. And if you read Genesis in that way, in the lens of the humans running away from God, rebelling, and God still pursuing them, it changes the whole dynamic of everything. Okay, so that is the detailed timeline of Genesis, the outline, the storyline thread, and the covenantal thread. I hope this was helpful. If it was, make sure you like, subscribe, even share it with someone who might find this interesting as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.